My name is Catherine Matthews, and I'm the Director of Education at Old North Illuminated. Welcome to tonight's speaker series event, and as always, thank you so much for your support of our programming. At Old North, we are committed to sharing the stories of all the people and communities that are part of our site's physical, spiritual, and social history. Old North Church sits on land that was once the land of the Massachusetts people. By the time Old North was built in 1723, the Massachusetts people had been driven and displaced from their homes. Their story and suffering have been obscured in the historical record, and still they survive. And the memories of their ancestors live on in the Massachusetts community. May we reflect on the lessons of history and learn from them. As some of you may know, this year we are celebrating the 300th anniversary of the founding of Christ Church in the city of Boston, also known as Old North. It has been an exciting year of events, and there are still more to come. This coming Sunday, October 22nd, we hope you'll join us for The Stones Cry Out with burial ground expert John Hansen. This will be an event that is both live at Old North and a live streamed event. So please go to Eventbrite for details of this fascinating look at how the words and images left behind can help us connect with the people of the past. On November 15th, we hope you'll join us for a speaker series event with Jordan Taylor. Jordan's talk is entitled Fake News in Revolutionary America, which I think is a great title. You can find details about this talk on Eventbrite as well. And in December, on the 14th, osteoarchaeologist Jane Leiden-Rousseau will offer a speaker series presentation about Old North's crypt, including what was learned during the recent restoration project. Finally, if you happen to be in Boston or plan to come to Boston, we hope you'll visit the church to see our new exhibit, which will open officially next Wednesday. The new panels weave together information about the church, the lantern signal, and the church community, and they follow the best practices in accessibility standards. We are really grateful to the Yawkey Foundation for funding the project. Tonight, we are so happy to welcome back Dr. Jaimie Crumley. Jaimie is an assistant professor in the Gender Studies and Ethnic Studies divisions of the School for Cultural and Social Transformation at the University of Utah. During the 2022 to 23 academic year, Jaimie was the research fellow at Old North, where her work transformed our site interpretation by recovering the stories of Black and Indigenous people who were part of the social and religious community of Old North. Jaimie's work can be seen in the award-winning web series, Illuminating the Unseen. Tonight, Jaimie will be talking to us about how some women of color in the urban North participated in the Episcopal Church in the 19th century. So with that, a final reminder to mute your microphones, put your questions in the chat, and enjoy tonight's talk. Jaimie, it's yours.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint presentation. Great, I hope you all can see that. Yes? Fabulous. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here this evening. I'm joining this evening's call from my office in Salt Lake City, Utah, where I live and work on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. As a member of the University of Utah community, I recognize and respect the enduring relationship that exists between many Indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. My talk this evening is about what many scholars who study African-American life and history in the early Republic and antebellum eras have called the fragility of freedom. Specifically, this talk's focus is on how women of color's participation in Northern Episcopal churches during emancipation's rehearsal both expanded and curtailed their freedoms during these uncertain years in the United States' early history. I borrow the phrase emancipation's rehearsal from historian Erica Armstrong Dunbar. She has written extensively about the experiences of Black Philadelphia women during gradual emancipation in Pennsylvania. While Dunbar's work focuses on the lives of Black women in Philadelphia, the experiences of free Black women in Boston and New York were quite similar. The experiences that freed Black women had in northern cities of Boston, Philadelphia, and New York from 1789 to 1860 anticipated, on a small scale, what emancipation might look like in the post-Civil War era throughout the nation. Free Black women's experiences in the North showed that freedom would arrive to Black Americans in fits and starts. The failure of emancipation to produce equal rights is also a history that Jacqueline Jones traces in her recent book about Black Bostonians during the Civil War era. The same patterns that Black people received freedom in name only persisted through the Reconstruction era. However, this evening's talk is not only about the false promises of freedom. This talk is, more importantly, about the choices that Black women made in the liminal space between freedom and unfreedom. I hope to demonstrate that from 1789 until the advent of the Civil War, women of color in northern cities were accomplishing something that was mostly foreclosed to them during the 18th century. They were actively choosing what faith tradition or traditions in which they would or would not participate. I say that actively choosing their faith tradition was mostly foreclosed to them because we do have examples of enslaved women who made declarations of faith and seem to have some semblance of religious freedom. However, generally speaking, enslaved women did not possess the full freedom to choose which religious communities they would or would not participate in. While many enslaved women might have, and likely did, practice their faith outside of formal houses of worship, it is nearly impossible for us to discover written records that tell us about those religious exercises. Freedom offered people of African descent many gifts. One of those gifts was the option to create religious institutions that they could lead on their own terms. While there's evidence that people of color worshiped together informally throughout slavery and freedom, in the late 18th century, they began to establish local churches that they insisted would be managed by people of African descent. The history of some of those institutions is our subject this evening. People of color have long found ways to connect with the divine. Of course, there are some who have chosen not to participate in any faith tradition at all. This evening, our focus is on the people of African descent who found their footing in the Episcopal Church during the decades before the Civil War. Before I get further into the talk, I will offer a few quick definitions that we can use as we proceed. This talk covers people of color's participation in the Episcopal Church during two different eras in the United States early history. Some of what I will cover tonight happened during the early Republic period. The early Republic period lasted from roughly 1780 to 1830. It was the era after the former 13 British colonies that came to call themselves the United States declared themselves independent from British rule and became a new nation. This era was defined by many big transitions. Perhaps the most significant of these transitions were westward expansion that occurred through the Louisiana Purchase and the Lewis and Clark expedition, and the expansion of domestic slavery, which was largely due to the impact of the invention of Eli Whitney's cotton gin. Some of what we will discuss tonight happened during the antebellum period. The word antebellum literally means before the war. The antebellum period lasted from roughly 1830 to 1860. Like the early Republic period that preceded it, the antebellum period was defined by transitions. Domestic slavery was on the rise. So too were calls to end it. The young nation had fully succumbed to becoming a slave society. Between 1780 and 1860, slavery grew fourfold, although the Atlantic slave trade closed in 1808. In 1789, there were 1 million enslaved Africans living in the United States. But by the outbreak of the American Civil War in 1860, there were 4 million enslaved Africans in the growing nation. Because the nation continued to expand west, there was a growing concern that newly admitted states would enter as slave states and slavery would become even more widespread. You will also hear me talk quite a bit about the Episcopal Church this evening. I am referring to women of color's participation in the Protestant Episcopal churches in the North and the Upper South. The Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America was founded in Philadelphia in 1789 as the Church of England's successor in the former 13 colonies. Because it was founded in 1723, Old North was originally a Church of England parish. Since 1789, it has been part of the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States. In this talk, I will define the North as Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. I have on the slides other states that are also in the North, but they are not the focus of this evening's talk. However, today I'm also going to focus on the Mid-Atlantic region and Southern New England, and I will discuss the Episcopal Church's development in the Upper South. And so when I talk about the Upper South, in the context of this talk, I'm talking about Maryland and Washington, D.C. There are also other states that are included in the phrase Upper South. And finally, another phrase that you'll hear me use frequently during this talk is women of color. I'm using the phrase women of color as an umbrella term. You might also hear me interchangeably use terms like Black or women of African descent. The word Black is a political and physiological term that can be used both as an analytic and as a way to bring together people with diverse experiences from across the African diaspora. While I do use the word Black at times, the phrase women of color seems to be a more precise way to describe all women of African descent, including mixed race women. During the 2 time periods that we are discussing this evening, free women of African descent used many terms to describe themselves. However, they commonly evoke terms such as people of our color, colored people, and women of color. So these are the primary terms that you'll hear me use a lot tonight during the talk. If you want me to clarify any of the terms that I use, please leave a note in the chat, and I will clarify during our questions and conversation segment at the end of the talk. I organized my comments around one woman of color's story. After I discuss her story, I will discuss a few problems that my research on women of color in the Episcopal Church elucidates about the field of African-American religious history. From there, I will discuss the value of resurrecting the stories of women of color who were members of Episcopal churches from 1789 to 1860. Finally, we will have time for questions and conversation. Please add your questions and comments in the chat as you think of them. Okay, story time. In 1838, a young man named Alexander Crumley returned to New York City. The city was his birthplace. He had been away studying at the Oneida Institute in Whitestown, New York. Although the Oneida Institute was short-lived, it was only in operation from 1827 until 1843. During its short run, it was the most radical educational institution in the United States. It laid the groundwork for schools like Case Western Reserve and Oberlin. These schools were, from their origins, intentionally interracial colleges that were invested in the anti-slavery cause. The radicalism of these schools went far beyond their commitment to abolition. These schools were some of the few places in the United States where a Black man was as welcome to participate as a white man. As students at Oneida, Crumley and his colleagues studied moral philosophy, and in 1838, Crumley numbered among the Institute's newest graduates. In 1839, Crumley became a candidate for holy orders within the Episcopal Church. The Diocese of Massachusetts received him as a candidate. During that same year, he applied for admission to the General Theological Seminary in New York. However, he was denied entry to the seminary. The seminary provided no reason for his unusual rejection. Typically, candidates for holy orders were always accepted into general seminary because they had already received the church's full endorsement. Therefore, Crumley, along with his friends and allies, could only assume that the seminary rejected him because of his race. Despite the setback, Crumley continued to pursue his vocational goals. From 1840 to 1841, he studied at Yale. Earlier this year, in April of 2023, Yale University bestowed the degree of M.A. Privatum to both Crumley and to James Pennington. Pennington was the university's first known Black student. The M.A. Privatum degrees are a symbolic indication that both men are now considered to be members of the Yale University community. The ceremonial bestowals were an attempt to reckon with the history of racial discrimination at Yale. In 1842, Crumley was ordained as a deacon at Boston's Trinity Church. The three Episcopal churches in Boston, which were Old North, formerly known as Christ Church, established in 1722, Trinity, which was founded in 1733, and St. Paul's, supported Black Episcopal clergy and their churches in the antebellum period. St. Paul's was founded in 1818 in Boston. It was the fourth Episcopal church to be founded in the city of Boston, and the first that was from its origins a fully American Episcopal church. The first Church of England parish founded in New England had also been in Boston. This parish, King's Chapel, became a Unitarian church in 1785 and has continued in that tradition since 1785. The support that Boston's Episcopal clergy offered to their Black colleagues was on display in July of 1833. On a July afternoon, Old North hosted Reverend William Levington. Levington was the Black rector of St. James's First African Episcopal Church in Baltimore, Maryland. Levington was to address the public, to share how Boston Episcopalians could support a school that he had established to serve Black children. However, the support that his colleagues in Boston was paternalistic. The brief announcement about his upcoming visit was burdened by racial overtones. The announcement you see on your screen right now, which was printed in the abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator, states that the white ministers of the three Episcopal parishes in Boston, along with Asa Eaton, who was a former rector of Old North, who then served as the city's domestic missionary, had examined Levington's papers to determine the worthiness of his cause. The four men agreed that Levington was a, quote, prudent, pious man of respectable intelligence and sound judgment, end quote. The brief announcement also clarified that any people of color who came to the church to hear Levington would have ample seating in the church's gallery. Throughout the British Atlantic world, Episcopal churches were interracial, but they were never integrated. People of color were always expected to sit in the galleries of their churches. So in that way, Boston churches were no different from other Episcopal churches in the Americas. However, what I want to demonstrate is that in the North, racial segregation in churches was a particular problem. Because in the North, especially in cities like Boston and Philadelphia, which were the homes of liberal notions of freedom, they continue to fail to allow people of color their full freedoms, even in houses of worship. Crumley's rejection from General Seminary, Levington's examination by white clergy in Boston before he could make his public address at Old North, and the ongoing policy of racially discriminatory seating in Episcopal churches demonstrated that there was a racial caste system at play in the antebellum Episcopal Church. Yes, Black men could be received into holy orders in the Episcopal Church. They served as official church leaders. However, the racial equality that Crumley so enjoyed when he attended the Oneida Institute did not exist in Episcopal seminaries in the United States, and it seems the seminary leaders believed they needn't clarify nor justify their racial biases. Without the seminary training that their white colleagues enjoyed, Black clergy could be treated as somehow subordinate or lesser to their white clergy counterparts. Likewise, Black people were always welcome to attend Episcopal churches. The records of most Northern Episcopal churches demonstrate that people of color were married, baptized, and buried at Episcopal churches, yet they endured racial discrimination while they worshiped. This discrimination is unsettling, but the racial discrimination that Black clergy faced is only a small part of the story that shapes my remarks for this evening. I am more interested in the experiences of the ordinary Black Episcopalians who spent the early Republic and antebellum periods up in the gallery. This evening, we turn our attention to a discussion of how we can tell the stories of Black women who chose to participate in Episcopal churches from 1789 until the Civil War. And so to that end, I want to focus not on the Alexander Crummell, who I just told you about, who was a leader in the 19th century Episcopal Church, but rather on the Alexander Crummell, who spent the 19th century learning about the distinct challenges of Black women and committing himself to supporting them. In 1833, Crummell wrote an essay, which is called The Black Woman of the South, Her Neglects and Needs. Crummell recognized the unique struggle that Black women had endured under slavery and the struggles that they continued to endure as free people. He did not come to his understanding of the distinct struggles Black women faced during and after slavery without some help from Black women themselves. One of the Black women who was instrumental to Crummell's formation as a priest, abolitionist, and women's rights activist was Maria Wellington Stewart. The image you see on your screen of Maria Stewart is the only confirmed image of her. As we continue to discuss her life, I hope we can consider the significance of the fact that this is the only known image of Maria Stewart. She was born Maria Miller in Connecticut in 1803. She was a mixed-race woman of African descent who was born free. Although she was freeborn, she did not enjoy a privileged upbringing. By age 5, she was an orphan. Without guardians to support her, she was sent to live with a clergyman's family. She worked in his household as a domestic servant. Such was the fate that awaited many Black women and girls in freedom because there were limited professional opportunities for Black women and girls, especially in the North. It seems that she learned basic reading and writing skills in the household where she worked, but as a child, she received no formal education. As a young adult, she moved to Boston, where she became well acquainted with the free Black community and the abolitionist cause. She received pastoral care from Thomas Paul at Boston's First African Church and mentorship from the firebrand abolitionist David Walker, who managed a clothing shop in Boston. On August 10th, 1826, she married a mixed-race shipping agent. His name was James Wellington Stewart. She took his middle and last name. Even after his untimely death in 1829, she continued using her husband's surname and middle name. James Stewart's will indicates that he had children before his marriage to Maria, but the two did not share children. After her husband's death, she was without any biological kin. And no doubt, she relied on other members of the free community of color in Boston for emotional, spiritual, and perhaps even financial support. Her late husband had been a man of some means, but wealthy lawyers defrauded her of the money that he left for her in his will, which included his pension from his service in the War of 1812. She, along with other widows of 19th century wars, was not to receive the pension money until 1879. In 1831, Maria Wellington Miller Stewart made history when she became the first United States-born woman of any race to address a mixed audience of men and women. In a culture that mandated that public life was for men and that women could only lead in the private space of their homes, her actions were unsettling. Nevertheless, she decided to join Boston's growing abolitionist public speaking and essay writing circuit. She consistently grounded her political arguments in the words of the Bible. For Maria Stewart, the best way to enter the political arena was for one to live as righteously as they could. As political theorist Kristen Waters has stated it, quote, Stewart remains faithful to the idea of covenant theology that holds that both grace and good works are necessary for salvation, end quote. Further, Waters argues that Stewart invoked two covenants in her political speeches and writings. The first was God's covenant with all of humanity, and the second was the United States Constitution's covenant with its citizens. Stewart's reference to covenantal theology built upon the common belief in New England that God had made a covenant with all who followed God. That said, her use of covenantal theology as a mixed race woman of African descent was subversive and led her listeners to consider exactly what was the content of a divine covenant with women of color in antebellum New England. Her use of the Constitution as a second covenant borrows from her late friend David Walker. In Walker's political writings, he had critiqued the United States for failing to ensure that men of all races received the promises of the Constitution. He encouraged his fellow Black Americans to adhere to the words of the Constitution, which asserted that people should overthrow any government that failed to live up to its promises. While Stewart's approach was less anarchist than Walker's, her writing demonstrates that she was not passive in the face of racism. She wanted Black Americans to speak up in defense of their rights and to know the reasons why they could not attain them. Despite her best efforts, Stewart felt that her message was neglected and even reviled in Boston. She believed this neglect was due to her gender and her insistence that Black people practice what she called Christian morality. By 1833, she was discouraged. In a speech that she offered at the African School in Beacon Hill on September 8, 1833, she defended her public speaking and said goodbye to the city. She declared to her audience, "What if I am a woman? Is not the God of ancient times the God of these modern days?" She continued, St. Paul declared that it was a shame for a woman to speak in public, but our great high priest and advocate did not condemn the women for more notorious offense than this. Neither will he condemn this worthless worm. She bid farewell to the city, but not to her faith and her political vision. She explained that she was willing to endure reproach because of her belief that a, quote, rich reward, end quote, awaited her in this life or in the life to come. With that, she began what would be a multi-year journey from New England and into the Upper South. After leaving Boston, she made her next home in New York City. It was in New York that she first encountered Alexander Crumley, who would become her long-term friend and ally. Crumley remembered that he and his friends met her after returning from their 3 years as students at Oneida. He wrote, quote, "I remember very distinctly the great surprise of both my friends and myself at finding in New York a woman of my own people, full of literary aspiration and ambitious of authorship. In those days, that is, at the commencement of the anti-slavery enterprise, the desire for learning was almost exclusively confined to colored young men. There were a few young women in New York who thought of these higher things, and it was a surprise to find another added to their number," end quote. While Cromwell's description of Stuart was paternalistic, it also speaks to her brilliance. Even without having received a formal education, she was ambitious, politically, and intellectually curious. Her life anticipated the large numbers of Black intellectual women who would emerge in the 1880s. Like those women, Maria Stuart believed that Black women were essential partners with Black men in the effort for Black self-determination in the United States. In Alexander Crumley, the well-educated and well-connected young church leader, Maria Stuart found a new friend and supporter. It seems like through her friendships with Crumley and his friends that she became acquainted with the Episcopal Church. In Boston, she had attended Thomas Paul's African Baptist Church, but her writings reveal that during her older adulthood, she had allegiance to the Episcopal Church. Perhaps as a woman who loved discipline and order, the Episcopal Church's liturgy spoke to her sensibilities. Crumley remembered that when he met her, Maria Stuart was a young widow who was still grieving her husband's loss. While he had grown up in relative privilege in New York with access to books, he noted that Stuart had been raised with no such formal education, yet she had brilliant ideas. Crumley explained that young women in the city helped to instruct her in arithmetic and geometry. In New York, she joined the Ladies' Literary Society and continued to compose brilliant writings. He stated that she gained sufficient education to become a public school teacher, and that she taught in schools in New York City and Brooklyn until she went further south to Baltimore and Washington, D.C. in 1853. In Baltimore and Washington, D.C., Stuart established private schools to serve Black children. Having been a public school teacher to that point, she had not predicted the cost of managing a school of her own. Although maintaining a school was expensive, she persisted because she perceived such need among the children of the Upper South and their families. In her reflections about her life in Washington, D.C. during the American Civil War, Stuart remembered the challenges that she had faced within the Black community and as a school teacher because of her commitment to the Episcopal Church. Her status as an Episcopalian was challenging because the Christian sects in her area had all agreed to form schools to serve their own. But the Episcopal Church had no plans to serve children of color. Yet she remained faithful to the Episcopal Church and helped to establish St. Mary's Church in Washington, D.C. Alexander Crumley, who had been serving in Liberia, was asked to lead the new church. It became the city's first African-American Episcopal Church. It was comprised of some members of the Church of the Epiphany. Of her experience of being rejected by her Black neighbors because of her faith and treated as a second-class citizen in the Episcopal Church because of her race, Stuart wrote, quote, "I have suffered martyrdom for the church in one sense, and rejoice that I now feel that I have a home, not only in the Protestant Episcopal Church, but in the Holy Catholic Church throughout the world," end quote. This quote is revealing, and it calls us to consider the meaning of home for a free-born woman from the North who had moved to the Upper South to care for newly emancipated Black children. The quote indicates that even for free-born Northern women in the 19th century, the home could be a contentious place. It was not always a place of peace, sanctuary, or respite. Sometimes home was a place of conflict and gradual growth. Sometimes home was a place where even free-born Black Northern women felt that they were second class. Yet the home was a place where they learned to advocate for themselves and the causes that were important to them. It makes some sense that Stuart was comfortable in this place that only partially offered her respite. The limited biographical information we know about her childhood reminds us that from a young age, Her home was within a place where she served as a domestic servant. Because of this experience of home as a place that was also a site of control, it should perhaps not surprise us that Maria Stuart could find herself at home even in a place that repeatedly disappointed her. Stuart's commitment to the Episcopal Church, despite its inconsistent support for people of color, is simultaneously impressive and disconcerting. It is impressive because it shows her audacity. That's one of my favorite words, audacity. She believed with all of her heart that the Episcopal Church must be compelled to serve Black children and their families. She was a devout church member, and she refused to allow the church that she loved off the hook. She eventually received funding and support for her work, but we know that that support came with much suffering. Because of parishioners like Maria Stuart, who refused to walk away from the Episcopal Church despite its racial caste system, the church rose to meet the challenges of its parishioners of African descent. While Maria Stuart's commitment to the Episcopal Church was impressive and has clearly impacted the church's stance on racial justice in contemporary times, we know that her participation in the church forced her to deny parts of herself. In the process, she temporarily neglected the needs of the Black children that she hoped to serve. Because of her association with a denomination that Black people in the Upper South mistrusted and that refused to support her work, she often did not have the resources she needed for her school. Had she been willing to associate herself with Christians who belonged to a different sect, she might have more easily accessed what she needed to care for the children whom she wanted to serve. Her story provides but one small example of how Black women's participation in the Episcopal Church during the antebellum era both expanded and curtailed their freedoms. Despite the painful experiences she endured as a Black Episcopalian in Washington, D.C., Stuart remained a proud participant in the denomination. She worked along other members of St. Mary's Church to establish St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C. When it held its first service in 1879, St. Luke's became the first independent Black Episcopal church in the city. Alexander Crumley actively supported members of St. Mary's in establishing the church. He also became the church's first rector and spent the remainder of his ministry at St. Luke's in Washington, D.C. Maria Stuart remembered the church in her will when she died sometime in 1879. It is remarkable that Maria Stuart wrote a will. The fact that she left a will reveals that despite the financial challenges she endured after her move into the Upper South, she persevered. And she still had something of her own that she could leave behind for her friends. She wrote on the first page of this will, quote, "I bequest to St. Luke's Protestant Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C., my U.S. bonds to the amount of $100 to be used as an endowment fund for the salary of the rector of said church," end quote. With contemporary inflation, that means that she left about $3,079 to the church. She would not live to see the church continue to grow, but it remains an active parish today. Today, St. Luke's is a national historic landmark because of the impact that it had on the Black community in Washington, D.C. On St. Luke's website, you will find a history page that contains videos that share the stories of some of the church's former rectors from 1879 to 2018. These leaders have carried on St. Luke's historic commitment to God, the Episcopal Church, and Pan-Africanist thought. These rectors include the Reverend Virginia Nolan Brown, who was the church's first female rector, who served St. Luke's from 1999 to 2010. I can only imagine how much her ministry would have meant to Maria Stuart. No doubt Stewart's activism laid the foundation for there to be a Reverend Virginia Nolan Brown within the Episcopal Church. While I doubt that Maria Stewart's contribution compensated the church's rectors after Alexander Crumley, her choice to leave a substantive gift to the young parish shows her commitment to the future of African-American Episcopalians. That Maria W. Stewart, a mixed-race abolitionist women's rights activist, would maintain her commitment to the Protestant Episcopal Church is a subject that is worthy of our interrogation. Further, her participation and that of other Black women in the Upper South to forming an independent African-American Episcopal churches in the decades after the Civil War offers an opportunity for us to contemplate the role of the Episcopal Church in Black social and religious life after 1789, and to consider what it meant in the 19th century for women of color to independently practice their Protestant Episcopal faith. The commitment that Stewart and other Black women made to the Protestant Episcopal Church is worthy of our study for several reasons. The most notable of these reasons is because most of the scholarly research about African-American religious history is about people of color in Baptist, Methodist, and African Methodist Episcopal churches. The focus on these denominations makes sense because large numbers of Black Christians associated with them. However, to focus exclusively on these denominations limits our understanding of the so-called Black church. Secondarily, people like Stewart and Crumley, who spent so much of their lives in the North and only came south to serve the newly emancipated community, remind us that there was also a robust Black church tradition that developed in the North. Much of the research on African-American religious life, I have a slide, from 1789 until the Civil War has focused on Black Southerners. The focuses on Baptist, Methodist, and AME churches, when paired with the focus on Black Southern people of faith, overlooked a few things. First, this focus overlooks the religious diversity that existed among Black Southerners. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Black people participated in an array of religious services in a range of churches. Some Black people rejected Christianity altogether in favor of faith traditions, including Islam, humanism, and African traditional religions. Second, the focus on Black religion in the South overlooks the cross-regional impact of the religious revivals of the 18th and 19th centuries. Historian Donald Matthews helpfully reveals that by the antebellum period, the Methodist and Baptist denominations in the United States shared a total of 89,600 members throughout the South, that they had gathered primarily during gatherings that historians have called the Great Awakenings. These Great Awakenings occurred in two stages, one between 1730 and 1755, and the other between 1790 and 1840. However, the writings of ministers in the North and in England reveal that these same religious revivals were happening throughout England and the British Atlantic colonies. Just as Black Southerners experienced religious fervor because of the revivals, so too did Black Northerners. As an outgrowth of their religious fervor, they flocked to English churches before the Revolution and began to form Black-led churches in the early Republic period. Third, by delving into the theology that undergirded Christian denominations, especially Methodism, we see clear linkages between the Episcopal Church and some of the traditions that gained prominence during the Great Awakenings. These traditions were derivative of the Episcopal or Anglican tradition. This connection is not surprising. In 1701, the Church of England had founded the most successful foreign missionary organization of the 18th century because of its interest in bringing English people who were scattered throughout the empire back into the faith and attracting African and indigenous peoples in the colonies into the faith. Many of the revivalists, including George Whitefield and brothers John and Charles Wesley, were former Church of England missionaries who built on their Anglican faith to develop new spiritual practices that they believed would attract believers in the colonies. While Methodist churches, which derive their name from the methodical way that they carry out worship, contained a lot of the theology and structure of Episcopal churches, Methodism differed from Anglicanism. Methodism advocated for lay preachers, simplified the liturgy, and held meetings in casual settings, such as private homes and forest. These practices made the church even more accessible to people of color and to low-income people of all races. No doubt, the Baptist and Methodist were popular within the African American community, but some members of the free Black community were also attracted to the Episcopal Church. We can see the impact the Episcopal Church had on people most clearly by focusing on the experiences of Black people in Philadelphia and New York City. Some white Episcopalians supported men of African descent in forming independent Black-led Episcopal churches. The most notable of these churches is the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas, which was founded in Philadelphia. Here in the image, you see an 1829 image of parishioners gathering for worship at the church. Throughout the 1790s, Absalom Jones, who was a free Black man, attempted to lead a group called the Free African Society. The church held regular religious meetings because they feared that there was no hope for interracial religious worship in the city after the incidents of racial violence during the worship services at some of the city's white-led churches. The work of Absalom Jones and the Free African Society attracted the attention of Joseph Pilmore. Pilmore is an example of the overlap I mentioned earlier between Methodist and Episcopal churches in the late 18th century. He was an English follower of John Wesley. He spent time in Philadelphia and was an ordained priest in the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States. In Philadelphia, he served as the assistant rector at St. Paul's Church. Because Pilmore supported people of all races, 31 Black couples married at his church between 1789 and 1794. According to historian Richard Nash, Pilmore's warmth toward Black families allowed Black Philadelphians to connect with the Episcopal Church in Philadelphia. In 1794, under Absalom Jones's leadership, the African Church of Philadelphia began to formalize its union with the Episcopal Church. They agreed to commit to the ecclesiastical affairs of the church to the government of the Protestant Episcopal Church. But they also insisted that only men of African descent could be elected to church offices, except that of the minister and assistant minister. On July 17th, 1794, the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas opened its doors for worship, with Absalom Jones as their minister. Because Jones did not meet the Episcopal Church's requirement that the clergy be able to read Greek and Latin, St. Thomas agreed to forego the right to send a representative to yearly conventions where church policy was set. While the arrangement with the Protestant Episcopal Church made the new church susceptible to white paternalism, it also offered them the opportunity to move toward freedom of worship, even when they remained within the structure of the Episcopal Church. Within monoracial congregations, they presumably experienced less racism during their Sunday morning worship, yet they remained under a semblance of white authority. The Episcopal Church's educational requirements meant that so long as Absalom Jones and any future minister did not know Greek and Latin, they were excluded from the opportunity to participate in shaping the policies of the church that they loved. The African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas was the first independent Episcopal church led by people of African descent. But people of color who were practicing Episcopalians quickly formed other independent Episcopal churches in the North. For example, in 1809, Black Episcopalians who were worshiping, sorry, I skipped ahead too fast. Black Episcopalians who were worshiping at Trinity Church, Wall Street in New York, formed an independent church called the Free African Church of St. Philip. The first minister was Reverend Peter Williams Jr., who was a noted abolitionist who served in the New York-based American Anti-Slavery Society. Alexander Crumley, when he was in New York, worshipped at St. Philip. In the 20th century, Black luminaries such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Langston Hughes were also parishioners at St. Philip. We can probably assume that during her time in New York, Maria Stuart at least attended some services at St. Philip. I will pause here to note that the history that I have just narrated is extraordinarily biased. It is focused on an official Black Episcopal Church leaders, such as Alexander Crumley and Absalom Jones. These official leaders were some of the most learned Black men in their communities. It was not until 1967 that the General Convention of the Church opened the diaconate to women. Although 11 women participated in what the Episcopal Church called an irregular ordination in Philadelphia on July 29th, 1974, women's ordination to the priesthood in the Episcopal Church was not approved officially until 1976. The first ordinations of women to the priesthood occurred in January of 1977. Among the female deacons who were ordained to the priesthood in the ceremony at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., was Polly Murray, who was an African-American writer and attorney. With her ordination in January of 1977, Murray became the first woman of African descent to become a priest in the Episcopal Church. Murray was trapped by what she, in a 1965 Law Review article, called Jane Crow. She believed this term illuminated how she and other Black women were trapped by both Jim Crow racism and 1960s misogyny. Polly Murray's papers are held at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard University. Because women were not ordained as deacons in the Episcopal Church until 1967, institutional histories of the church often exclude them and their experiences. Therefore, we know woefully little about the experiences of Black women in 19th century Episcopal churches. These women leave us with the challenge to continue to dig. Most findings in the field of African-American religious history agree that so-called Black churches would not exist were it not for Black women's leadership. It is easy to narrate the history of some of the earliest independent Black Episcopal churches in the United States, primarily through the lens of Black male clergy who helped to establish the churches. However, we know that any organization is so much more than just its leaders. Our challenge is to uncover the writings of more Maria Stuarts, who share about their experiences as Black Episcopal women, who chose the Episcopal Church, even when it did not always choose them. In conclusion, the exclusion of Black women from formal authority has historically been common across Christian denominations in the United States. It is an ongoing problem today, although there are many women of African descent who accept calls to Christian ministry and are trained in seminaries and divinity schools. Elsewhere, I have described Black women such as Maria Wellington Miller Stewart as unordained ministers who offered care and correction to their community, even without the formal title of minister or pastor. I've chosen to focus on women of color in the Episcopal Church in this talk because Old North is an Episcopal church, and also because the experiences of Episcopal women of color remain understudied when compared to the experiences of Black women in other faith traditions. Nevertheless, these women and their stories matter to the lives of congregations today. The challenge that a woman like Maria Stuart faced remind us that we must not continue to place structural barriers before people that prevent them from achieving their social and political goals. These barriers impact not only them, but also the people who they feel bound to protect. The racism and sexism that Mariah Stewart endured made life harder for the Black children she wanted to serve. We are left only with our imaginations of how newly emancipated Black children's lives in Washington, D.C. might have been different had she received a different level of support. I now welcome your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Jaimie. That was fascinating. While people are gathering their thoughts, I am struck by Mariah Stewart's courage, the mobility that she showed within her life, and her willingness to reinvent herself is inspirational. And I also do see, if you think about that emphasis on covenant, that she was not going to let institutions not live up to what they could be or what she felt they had promised that they would be. Would you agree with that, or am I overreading this?
Yes, I would agree. She certainly, courageous is probably the way to put it. But she's also evidence of the ways that women of color were going in between faith traditions. I'm assuming that having been born in Connecticut in 1803, she probably was most accustomed to more of a congregational or Puritan religious tradition. And then, of course, going to Boston, where there's this really strong and emerging free community of people of color, that she was able to connect with Black Christians there. And a lot of them were attending the African church, which happened to be a Baptist church. But as we went into the 1830s and 1840s, and there was more diversity within the Black community and more free people of color, she was able to access this larger community, that included people like Alexander Crumley, who were not Baptist and who were not Methodist and were not congregational in the way that she was accustomed to. And it's just so fascinating the way that perhaps we can put it on that one friendship, right? And the friendships that she had with his friends and with the ladies he introduced her to in the city, that really changed the course of her spiritual life.
We have a question and a comment. Ann Mort says, thank you sincerely for this important work. With your academic hat off for a moment, Mariah Stewart's sustained commitment in spite of repeated demeaning challenges makes me think that the value she found might have been deeper and more personal than religion or faith or the Episcopal Church. If you agree, what is your sense of what that deeper value might have been?
Yeah, thank you, Anne. Great question. I'm going to read the question. So, I mean, that's the great thing with chat. I can look at the question here. Of course, I work on these women as, I do a lot of work on Black abolitionist women, and I work on them as Christians, right? Because I think that one of the challenges is they have been seen in recent years, which is excellent, as proto-Black feminist thinkers, right? The kind of foremothers, right, of the kind of thought that we see from Polly Murray in the 1960s, who's saying that she's suffering under Jane Crow oppression, right? Mariah Stewart was very clear that as a woman of color, she was suffering both from racism and sexism, right? And that was a big part of her political vision. One thing that I think that gets overlooked is the connection between her politics and religion, right? That actually, for her, couldn't be disentangled from each other, right? Because one of her concerns when she left Boston was that she felt that people rejected her both because of her politics, because she was a woman, and also because she was like insistent about adding the religion thing to everything. She was super insistent about that. And we see that in some other Black women of her time and Black women who preceded her, like, right? We see that in the life of Phyllis Wheatley Peters, for example, and who's not, who, depending on the scholar who you're talking to, some folks think of Phyllis Wheatley Peters mostly as a religious figure. Some people think of her mostly as a writer. Some people don't even think of her as an abolitionist at all. So yeah, I think the challenge with studying Black abolitionist women, right, and these women who, and as you say, she was facing being demeaned, right? Like, it's not just about the politics, right? It's also about the everyday experience of racism and sexism that she was unable to escape. And so the challenge is, how do we disentangle the personal experience, the political experience, the religious experience? Perhaps they don't need to be disentangled. Perhaps they do need to be disentangled. I mean, I think those are like kind of the massive questions within all of the subfields that I work within. As a feminist, I would say the personal is the political, right? So whatever it is that she was experiencing, right? So when she was a domestic worker at age 5 in a clergyman's household, like, I cannot detach that from everything else that happened in her life, right? What is the experience, not only of being a domestic worker at age 5, which is absurd, but also being a domestic worker in the home of a clergy person, right? And he's teaching her these lessons about morality while holding her as a domestic servant. And it's difficult to kind of disentangle what would that have meant for her formation. It's kind of difficult to disentangle. But yeah, that's a great question. I'll have to keep thinking about it. Thank you.
Anyone else have a question or a comment that you'd like to make? The community is an interesting idea too, like that she, without family, no husband any longer, she seems to have been very good at finding community that would support her. It would be really interesting to hear more about that, about the women that were mutually supportive of one another, but also about, I'm struck, I think you were at Cherno Sisay's talk where he talked about the way that institutions formed, the role that they played in Black lives. So, but all lives actually. So
yeah, so Dr. Sisay in his talk, I remember he was talking about in the churches, Black folks being the godparents of children who were being baptized in the church, right? So we see these really deep connections being forged, right? And friendship being really central to the political story, right? Like, there is no, and that might be the bigger theme, right, than the religious theme. Friendship might be the biggest theme, because I didn't narrate every aspect of Mariah Stewart's life, obviously. But one of the ways that she ends up receiving the pension from the from her husband's service in the War of 1812 is because she had a friend, Louise Hatton, who was a Black woman who knew her in Washington, D.C., but had not known about her activism earlier in her life. And she went to go see Mariah because she was headed on a trip to Boston and went to go tell her goodbye. And Mariah said, "Oh, well, while you're there, there's this pension I've been agitating for 50 years now. So if you can go see what you can find out about that, that would be awesome." And so Louise went, while she was in Boston, she went and talked to some of the oldest members of the community of color in Boston who still remembered James and remembered his marriage with Mariah. And she went through old court documents, right? And so it was the combination of this younger woman's friendship with her and these older folks who refused to forget her, right? And refused to forget her husband, who helped her. It was in the last year of her life, right? Which is terrible, 50 years later, but helped her finally receive what was due to her. And so, yeah, so this friendship and community, and it also goes back to her audacity that she asked for what she wanted all the time. Like, I just cannot believe that this woman came to her and said, "Hey, I'm going to Boston, see you later." And she said, "Actually, do some work for me while you're there." But it reflects the same themes that we see in her writings when she was a younger woman in the 1830s, that she was saying, especially to other women of color, like, sue for your rights. She just has that in her speeches. And so of course, she had to demand that she received what she knew was due to her. So it's a combination of audacity, and real genuine friendships, right? Which we also see with Alexander Crumley, I think it's so amazing that he goes from saying, like, not many women of color wanted to think, to like, Black women are really suffering, right? And there's a way that it's actually his responsibility to advocate for Black women. And I just wonder, we will never know for sure, but I wonder how much the Black women who were his parishioners, including Mariah W. Stewart, influenced that kind of change in his thought, where he understood it's not like there's something wrong with Black women that they don't want to learn. The actual issue is this burden of racism and sexism, and it's my responsibility to advocate for them.
And you can even think about David Walker's insistence that education was going to be critical to the survival and the flourishing of the Black community.
Right.
Yeah. Does anyone else have anything that they would like to add to this discussion tonight? Well, we will wrap it up then with sincere thanks, Jaimie. As always, you've given me a lot to think about, and it's been great to see you again.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Have a good evening.
Take care now. All right, bye, everybody. Thank you.